The centre front panel can be gathered like the one I am wearing, or if you're feeling a bit fancy, you can do some smocking. I love the effect of the smocking pleater, and sometimes I don't bother with the smocking, like in this silk and cotton version. I love the effect of the stitching, and so sometimes I just leave it at that. So, how you choose to finish yours is up to you, but today I'm going to show you how I do my smocking. Smocking machines can seem intimidating, but actually they're really easy to use, especially if you know these little tricks. First of all, use a needle threader to thread the needles. This will make life much easier. Also, if your pleater has a black base like this one, putting a sheet of white paper underneath will also help with threading the needles. I've got 16 needles on here, and I like to use alternating threads because that helps me plan out my smocking pattern. To thread the pleater, take a thread, and normally I would thread right to left because I'm right-handed, but for the sake of the video I'm going to use it from left to right because that's easier for you to see what I'm doing. So I slide the needle threader into the needle, push my thread through, pull it up. I want to keep the tail quite short because that will make it easier to pull it out after the fabric is pleated. It's tempting to make that tail quite long. Trust me, don't. I've done it. It actually makes life harder. So here's my last one. To do the 16 needles, if I'm having a bad eyesight day, it takes me about 5 minutes, but you can see that's actually really quick and easy to thread those needles. By consistently threading your needles in the same direction, it also is easier when you have pleated your fabric to unthread it, because if all the short tails are on top, you can easily pull them out and you know which threads to pull out of the needles as you are removing it from the machine. My smocking machine is all threaded, and here is my centre front panel. So this is the wrong side up, and I'm going to roll that onto this piece of cardboard, making sure it's nice and even. I think the smocking machines actually come with a piece of dowel, but mine didn't, it was second hand, so I just use that instead. So I'm going to pop that to one side, bring my smocking machine over, making sure that my threads are hanging off the table and it's nice and straight. Now I'm going to thread this piece of cardboard with the fabric into the machine, and I'm just going to slot it into the rollers, leaving a 1 centimetre gap at the top, and then you simply just start rolling. So once it catches, it's easy. There we go. Rolling that along, and it slides onto the needle, so try and keep it as straight as possible. You may need to pause at times and just slide your fabric down the needles, and then at some point you will have to take it off the roll, but I do find that it actually helps keep it quite straight. So rolling that along, and then maintaining a nice even tension as it slides along those needles. Pushing it down, and then roll it all the way through and slide off the needles. And this is where you'll see that having those shorter tails that we started with makes it much easier to pull it off the needles and the threads. So a little trick as well, if you use the needle threader to thread them, that you know that you went down, so you just pull on the top thread and that will pull out of the fabric like so. So shuffling them all off. It's just like a little bit of magic, this process. Just never stop getting excited by it. And there it is, all smocked. So what you want to do is arrange the gathers evenly, and you can see what I mean. The stitching on its own just looks so beautiful. So let's get that ready for smocking. With my centre front panel, I need to make this measure 8 centimetres. So whether I am smocking it or whether I was going to just leave the stitching in, I need to secure all of these threads. So I just like to sew them down. Now, I've recently discovered self-threading needles, and my goodness, these things are a game changer. So all you have to do is just slide the thread over the needle and it's threaded. So you can just overstitch these edges. So I just stitch in place 3 or 4 times just to secure it, and I work my way down one side, and then I can pull the gathers on the other side to make it measure exactly 8 centimetres. If I was to just try and gather that now, it would also just slide off one end. So this may seem like a little bit of a process, but in the long run it really saves you time. So I'm just going to do that all down the side. So here is my smocking, and I've sealed all of the ends. And then what I like to do is just trim off some of those threads, because they can really get in the way when I am doing my smocking. So I just leave a little bit of a tail. So when I do my smocking, all of those coloured threads will get pulled out, but for the moment I just find it much easier to have them secured. Next, I'm just going to shuffle the gathers along so that I've got my 1 centimetre seam allowance on each side, because I need to make sure that my smocking stays within that sort of, well, 6 centimetres really, because I've got 1 centimetre each side for my seam allowance. So that is ready to be smocked. Now, I know that for some of you it's good to know what to do when things go a little bit wrong. So if you have a look at my smocking here, you can see that it actually is a little bit skewed along that edge. So I'm not going to fixate on it, I'm not going to go and rethread it, I'm just going to trim that off to make it nice and even. Yes, it's slightly off grain, but in the scheme of things, does that really matter? Do I really want to thread all those needles again? I think not. I'm going to work with that. So now I'm ready to get smocking. I've chosen these colours to go with my fabric. I've got a sort of natural white, a sort of ecru colour, a pale peachy colour, and 2 shades of green that I'm going to work back into with my embroidery and with the smocking. So I'm predominantly going to use the white because I want to tone down the yellow a little bit because it is so bright. So I make no claims of being an expert at smocking. Like I said, I like quite a naive style, and you know, little quirks and what other people might call errors, I call design features, and I think those things give something that's handmade a bit of charm. So if you want to be a perfectionist about it, by all means. I have great admiration for those fine embroiderers, but I'm just not one of them. So I will show you my way of smocking. Just to start with, I'm shuffling my gathers over so that I have my 1 centimetre each side, and you know, those are going to move, so you just have to keep shuffling them back just to hold them in place. Now the first thing I'm going to do is a securing row of stitching along the top. So in smocking tutorials I've seen they actually use a smocking thread, but given my style, I find that I should do this better in just an ordinary thread. So I'm just using a coordinating colour. I've threaded my self-threading needles. As I said, these things really, they've changed my life with my eyesight fading. They have been absolutely brilliant. So making sure that I've got my 1 centimetre seam allowance, I'm just going to do an initial stitch. I've knotted the thread and it's double, and I'm just going to over sew once to hold that in place. Next I come over to the next ridge, and you will find that when you're starting off you need to shuffle them over a bit, and just picking that up, and I'm coming through and pulling that quite securely. And I just work my way along, pulling that quite nice and firm, because remember this is going back down to our 8 centimeters in this case. Just check your size when you're doing your measurements, and working my way along. So I'm just going to do that the whole way on this little piece of fabric. And I'll put up a little graphic to show how I do this, because it can be sometimes tricky to see. So I'm going to pause the video at this point while I carry on, and I'll show you how it looks finished. Here I have finished off my top row of stitching. I'm just going to make sure I have that 1 centimeter seam allowance on the edge, and I'm just going to take the needle through to the wrong side and just over sew to secure that thread, like so. And trim that off. And there we have that secure stitching. So this is really important. So if you decide to do this smocking but without the actual smocking, so you just want the pleating, and that's going to be your feature on the dress, do this top row, because that just evenly arranges all the gathers and sort of keeps them as little pleats rather than as flat gathers. So then for the rest of it, it's all secured on the sides, and you can insert this into the front of your dress. But I'm going to be smocking. So I've been thinking about my smocking, and I think I'm just going to use this natural white for all the smocking down the front, and for the actual embroidery I'll introduce all those colours. So with the embroidery threads, if you are clever, you can just pull on one to slide it out of its whatsits. So let's pull on that, and it's not sliding out, so I'm going to end up with a little mess here. I'm just going to take them off. And so I like to have a fairly long piece to start with. Partly I suppose it's my aversion to threading needles, but now that I've got my self-threading needles, I actually don't mind that much. Then I'm going to divide it in half, so I've got 3 threads in each half, and I'm just going to separate those 2 threads. I tried doing this with just 2 threads, and I wasn't as happy with the result. It just didn't quite have that sort of thickness that I really like, that goes with a more naive style of embroidery. So I'm taking my self-threading needle, and I actually just give it like a little bit of a twist, because it's got those 3 threads, and clip that into the needle like so, and knot the end, and then I'm going to bring the needle up from the wrong side and just under that first row of stitching, and kind of like with the first one, we just go back on itself with the first pleat, and then so I've got my pink, blue, pink, so I'm just going to come down to just below the pink one and come across. So it's got that little wrap, and then I come across to the second pleat, so keeping my needle always in the same direction, and pick up that pleat and bring the thread over, and that creates a sort of little stitch. and then I come up to the top of that plate and go through as well. So the needle is just always going in the same direction, and I find that the easiest way to remember. And then I'm going to come over and catch the plate. So this time the thread is under, so you can see my little stitch is neat. And then come down, and you can just shuffle your pleats around a little bit too, just so that makes it easier to pick up, and go through. So the sort of long thread sort of effectively wraps around the plate. And you can do all your smocking by hand, the stitching, and you can get special smocking templates with dots that you can iron onto your fabric. So there's many different ways that you can approach it. Nothing is right or wrong, and it's really just to get that effect that you want. So just going along, picking up all of those little plates. And I'll include a graphic so you can see clearly the direction of the plates. So there's all different kinds of smocking stitches that you can do. This is just my preference, and I suppose I'm something of a creature of habit, so I just keep doing the same one over and over again because I just like it. And you're the designer of your garment, so you can do what you like as well. And there you can see the pattern is starting to take shape. So I'll carry on with that and come back to you. Here I've finished the first row of smocking, and you can see that that's looking really pretty and it's evened out all the pleats. If you wanted to, you could actually just do one row and leave it at that and pull out the other threads, or you can carry on like I'm going to. Remember, there's no right and wrong to this, it's just what you like. This smocking creates a kind of zigzag, and if you reverse the zigzag it creates a sort of diamond pattern. To do that, I'm going to start at the bottom this time and hook around the first plate, then I come up, and then I create this sort of matching stitch underneath the first one, catching the other plate, just shuffle that down like so, and then coming down to the bottom and working my way all along, always keeping the needle in the one direction. So just do a couple more, and you can just shuffle the pleats along using your needle because they will move a little bit. And coming up, like so, and there you can see I'm starting to get a diamond pattern. So I'm going to carry on with that. When you're getting low on thread and you're mid-row, what I like to do is just do part of my smocking. So I come up through one pleat, and then rather than coming back through the pleat like we normally would, I go back through to the wrong side to knot off, and then when I start my sewing again I'm going to come up through that plate where I finished off, and then that's just going to create a completely seamless start for the rest of my smocking. Here's my new thread, so I just separate those pleats coming up and carrying on with that nice smocking rhythm. And there you can see it's seamless. I've finished the smocking. Here it is. How pretty does that look? So that is now ready to be sewn into the side front panels. For some of you, doing hand smocking might seem like too much hard work, but you might like the effect, and so you can actually achieve a smocking effect using your sewing machine. Here I have my centre front panel, and I have drawn on the seam allowances on each side using a friction marker. I have then ruled 8 rows of stitching lines, which are 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch apart. I've used the purple friction marker because I find that erases more easily than, say, the pink one. Now we're ready to start sewing. The first thing I need to do is create my gathering stitches. So I'm going to start from one edge, and I put the foot down, and then I just move the needle because every stitch needs to start in exactly the same place. So my needle is down, and I'm just going to do 2 stitches back, and then I'm going to sew forward. I've set my machine to the largest stitch possible, and I'm going to sew right to the edge of the material, leaving tails on the end that I can pull. So I haven't sewn right to the fraying bit. I've given myself about a stitch length back from that. Now I'm going to sew all 8 rows. So each time I make sure the needle is down exactly at the same starting spot. Do 2 stitches backwards, which is going to lock the thread and prevent it from coming undone when I gather it, and sew along, coming to the end and cutting it off, leaving the threads. So I'm just going to sew along all 8 rows, and I'll speed that up so you don't have to watch each one. So there we have it. All 8 rows are sewn, and I just want to be very clear that when I'm doing the back tacking, I'm back tacking on the seam allowance side, not on the actual stitching side of my fabric. Next, we need to gather the fabric. I'm going to do 2 rows at a time, and that's why it's a good idea to sew your rows in pairs. So I'm going to take 2 of my threads, and I'm going to slide the fabric along to gather it up. So by having back tacked on that starting point, that means that we're not actually gathering into our seam allowance, which is a good little trick. And we need to gather this to the length that you need for your pattern piece. So in my case, that's 8 centimetres. Next, I'm going to work my way down, and you can just use your snips to lift those threads if they're getting all a little bit tangled, and pull them to match the gathers above. So just work your way down all the rows until you have even gathering that measures your required amount. And you might just need to adjust as you go. They might just come a little bit undone. And look, isn't that easy? I have to say it's actually probably easier than trying to thread up the smocking machine. So check that you have the right distance, and it measures what you want it to, and the gathers are even. Next, we want to lock those threads. So we could tie them off, but I'm going to show you my little trick. And that is, if you turn the fabric over, make sure your threads are free. I've used a matching thread because I don't intend to pull these threads out, so I just wanted it to match my fabric, but you could do that if you wanted to. Next, you take the underneath threads, and again I'm just going to do this in pairs, and if you give them a little pull, it actually locks the threads so that if you try and pull those top ones now, they're not going anywhere, and that's actually much easier than sewing them all off or tying them all off. So just do that all the way down to lock the threads. Okay, now I need to give that a little press. I've got my machine set up for a triple stitch zigzag, and I've set that onto the widest zigzag and quite a narrow stitch, but play around with your machine to see which stitches work best. I'm going to start sewing from within the seam allowance so that when it's sewn into the side front panels, the smocking stitch will look continuous. And take that out and cut the threads. How pretty does that look? And by using the double threads, it just gives an extra thickness to the stitching lines that makes it more like smocking. So now I'm just going to sew all of those rows. And there we have it, my faux smocking. I think that looks really pretty, and that was very fast to do as well. A great substitute for regular smocking if you fancy something different. It may be that you don't fancy doing smocking or faux smocking, and you just want the centre front of your panel to be gathered. I'm going to show you how to do easy gathering on your sewing machine, and I'm going to use a contrasting thread so that you can easily see what I'm doing, although I would recommend actually using a matching thread if you're doing this on the real thing. I've drawn on my seam allowances across the sides and the top in a friction marker which will erase, but I also know that these will actually disappear when I iron it. So I've set my machine to the longest stitch, and I'm going to sew 2 rows of stitching on each side of that seam allowance, and I can pull these threads out after. So what I'm going to do is start by lining up my needle with the seam allowance that I've drawn on the side, and then I'm going to back tack 2 stitches which will lock the thread, which means that I only have to pull it from one side, which when you're gathering a short distance is much easier because it stops the threads from pulling out. So I'm sewing my first row of stitching, and I'm going to sew almost to the edge, leaving a gap of about 1 stitch. Then I'm going to sew the second row on the other side of my seam allowance line, making sure my starting point is exactly the same as the other side, and that's why drawing on your seam allowance is a really useful trick. And then sewing the same distance away from my seam allowance line. So if I show you that, you can see those 2 parallel lines. Next, I'm going to take the 2 top threads and I'm going to pull them to gather them. So in the sample that I'm making, it needs to be gathered to 8 centimeters, so just work out what you need for your piece. Shuffle those gathers along, and then when you're happy with the distance, fold your fabric over to the wrong side and pick up the 2 threads from the bobbin. Now if you give them a little pull, it locks the stitching, so now if I try and pull those top threads, they're not going anywhere, which then allows me to even out those gathers ready for sewing into the side fronts and the neck facing. The other thing that having 2 rows of stitching does is if you pull them, you can see they go into beautiful little folds, whereas if you only have 1 row of stitching, it can actually sort of create uneven pleats, and that is super even. Here is my little sample all pressed, and you can see the gathers are sitting beautifully, and I just want to show you how I would sew this onto another piece of fabric. We did our 2 rows of stitching with our seam allowance row in the middle. So when we put it onto another piece of fabric, we need to sew in between those 2 rows, which is going to give us a really neat finish with our gathers. So I've set my machine back to a normal stitch, back tacking, and then I am sewing right in the middle of those 2 rows of gathers. back tack at the end, and I'm just going to snip those threads, and if I open that out you can see one row of gathers is showing. So all I need to do is pull those threads out. So I did back tack at one end, and this is why if you're going to do it you should just use a matching thread. This one is just for demonstration, and that easily pulls out, and there you have beautiful gathers. You could pull out the other row if you want, but it's not necessary because that will go into the overlocking and be pressed out of the way. So there you have it. Super easy gathering using your sewing machine.